A story we recently aired on Bridge City News about Christian woman Asia Bibi being acquitted on blasphemy charges in Pakistan. To discuss this in more detail is award-winning journalist Brian Lilley, who joins me now from Toronto. Brian, Bibi may finally be coming to Canada to join her daughters.
Uh, and that is the hope, and the hope of so many. And of course, we recently saw the young woman from Saudi Arabia who was brought into Canada in a great fanfare. I hope that for the sake of Asia Bibi, that perhaps it's handled with a little bit more care, not as much grandstanding by the government, because this is a woman who, like Ms. Muhammad, could face an awful lot of threats against her life for coming here, despite the fact that the high courts in Pakistan have rejected calls for her to be sentenced to death over what were trumped up blasphemy charges. The fact is, these blasphemy charges or these blasphemy laws still exist in Pakistan, and some people still take them seriously. And unfortunately, we have people in Canada that take those charges seriously. I would wish and I would hope, and it's always been my hope as the child of immigrants that come from a place with an awful lot of sectarian strife themselves, that when people come here, they leave the old quarrels behind. That doesn't always happen. There's sometimes a small minority. And so we've got to hope that for Asia Bibi's sake, that things are handled with more care, more diplomacy, more tact than they were with Miss Muhammad. But the good news is she could be coming here. This comes after she was rejected by several European countries, including Britain, because they were worried about upsetting certain communities. Isn't that a sad statement, Hal?
Brian, the federal government is offering money for illegal border crossers, but only a fraction. Ottawa's put forward $114 million, but the requests from Ontario, Quebec, Toronto, and Ottawa total over $600 million.
Yeah, so the federal government is offering 114.7 million. Now, only 100 million of that will go to the provinces, and the provinces have at least 500 million. But getting close to that $600 million level, when you add in Manitoba, when you add in new figures, just this week, the City of Toronto tabled their new budget, and they said for the coming year they expect to spend $45 million dealing with this issue with their shelters. That's not included in the province of Ontario's total. The previous figures of 75 million, that's included in the province of Ontario's figures, but not this new 45 million. Then you've got Manitoba's figures. And so you start getting close to that $600 million mark, and the feds are offering all the provinces 100 million. Well, wait a minute. Is that really enough? I mean, specifically to the City of Toronto, which is now bearing the brunt. Previously, it was Montreal. It was Quebec generally, but Montreal specifically, that was bearing the brunt of people coming across illegally at Roxham Road. Now they're coming across and moving directly down the 401 from Quebec into the City of Toronto. More than 2,500 people a night, Hal, are added to the shelter rolls due to this refugee asylum seeker influx, illegal border crosser, whatever you want to call it. Prior to this, the average shelter used per night in the City of Toronto was 4,100. That was the average for the entirety of 2016. Now it is about 6,700. And the City of Toronto will tell you 25 to 2,600 of those are the result of people coming here through the United States illegally and claiming asylum. So this is causing huge, huge problems for provincial budgets when it comes to social assistance, municipal budgets when it comes to shelter costs. The City of Ottawa is feeling the strain as well, and the federal government is offering a pittance. And when I write about this, Hal, the most common response I get is, well, there's only one taxpayer anyway. Yes, but the federal government is responsible for immigration. The federal government is responsible for refugees and asylum seekers. And by not dealing with this, they are putting the pinch on provinces and municipalities, which means that recreation budgets, that education budgets, that health budgets aren't being funded the way they should, because they've got to spend this money elsewhere or borrow the money and go into deficit. And that simply isn't right. So Justin Trudeau needs to pay up the full thing. He's not yet, and both the Ontario and Quebec governments continue to press him to do so.
Brian, speaking of some huge money, the federal Tories and Liberals brought in some big bucks last quarter. According to a fundraising return posted to Elections Canada's website, the Tories raised $7.3 million and the Liberals $6.3 million. So overall in 2018, the Tories raised a total of $24.3, while the Liberals brought in $16.5. That's not chump change.
It's not chump change, but surprisingly, that's not the best year that the Liberals have had under Justin Trudeau as their leader. And the fact that they're $8 million behind the Conservatives, that tells you that, well, when it comes to voting with their wallets, Canadians aren't backing the Liberals at the moment. Now, you could put this down to the fact that an awful lot of the support for the Liberals comes from Quebec, and Quebecers are the least likely to donate to any cause. Atlantic Canada is shortly behind them. That's not casting dispersions upon them. You look at charitable giving, and those sections of the country are the least likely to donate to any charitable cause, politics, hospitals, anything. So there's a real problem for the Liberals that they're $8 million behind. The Conservatives had their best year ever outside of an election year. The only year that beats this 2018 is 2015. And their fourth quarter is their best fourth quarter ever. So if Canadians are starting to tire of Justin Trudeau, then they're showing it with their wallets. Whether that will turn into votes at the ballot box come October, that remains to be seen. But it's got to be concerning for the Liberals that they're that far behind, because often it's the governing party. And remember, for most of 2015, the Conservatives were the governing party. So they're raking in the money because people want to curry favor with the guys that pull the levers, right? Well, now the Liberals hold the levers of power, and they're trailing the other guys by a third. That's bad news for them.
A clock has started ticking for Canada to extradite Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou to the United States to face criminal charges. She's currently out on bail in Vancouver. Brian, China is warning both countries to halt all proceedings against the Huawei executive.
Yeah, China is throwing around its weight and showing what they will be like as a superpower. Now, people are saying Canada's already stuck between two superpowers, the United States and China. I would say that China is an emerging superpower or on the cusp of being a superpower. They're not showing themselves to be the type of superpower that we would want. And for all the people that have been saying we've got to have a free trade agreement with China, we've got to curry favor with China, China's behavior through all of this has shown this is not the way to go. It was a one-off comment of Justin Trudeau saying he admires their basic dictatorship back around 2013, 2014. But simple fact of the matter is they are still a basic dictatorship. They don't respect the rule of law. They don't respect intellectual property. So companies doing business there have trouble. Canadians doing business there get arrested if you upset the country, if you upset the regime. I think there's an awful lot of problems that China has exposed itself to that maybe for critics like myself were bubbling under the surface. But now, in the wake of all of this, they're laid bare for everyone to see, and they don't look good. We have to uphold our treaty obligations to the United States. We have to go through the court process. And if the court says, yes, there are reasons to extradite her, then the federal government and Justice Minister David Lambetti, Trudeau's newly appointed Justice Minister, said this, then he'll sign off on it. If the court says that there are problems with it, then he won't sign off on it. But we have a process, and we have to follow it.
Brian, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper is back in the news again. He's offering a new warning about the dynamic of elites versus populists that he said led to U.S. President Donald Trump's election. He suggests populist conservatism is the solution.
It's an interesting video, and it's for a group called PragerU. Now, Dennis Prager is a longtime talk show host out of Los Angeles who also hosts a popular online forum. He does a lot of educational videos from a conservative point of view. And he looked at what Stephen Harper had in his book. And if you haven't read his book, I really do recommend it. Often politicians write these books and you'll read 2 chapters and you're going to wake up in the morning holding the book and you've fallen asleep and drooling on yourself. No, Stephen Harper's book is well written. It's not as dry as the man himself. So, there's my recommendation for it. And in the video that he did for PragerU kind of looks at this and said, look, you've got Brexit, you've got Trump, you've got all these things happening around the world. What's going on with this revolt against the elites by the general population? Is it because maybe the people at the top aren't listening to the concerns of people at the bottom? And he goes into it. He didn't coin these terms, but he uses the terms the anywheres versus the somewheres. The anywheres are the people that float around the world and can live anywhere, and the somewheres are people that are rooted in a specific place. And he talks a lot about that. It is being dismissed by people like Jerry Butts, the Prime Minister's principal secretary. It's being dismissed by people that hold that similar worldview. But those are the people that just had their butts handed to them in a couple of different elections. Maybe they want to start paying attention to the concerns of the little guy, or the little guy is going to take it out on them at the ballot box.
Conservative leader Andrew Scheer says voting for Justin Trudeau in the fall federal election would be a complete disaster, since it'll make life a lot more expensive for all of us here in Canada.
I think this is going to be the Conservative theme over the next several months, Hal. And, we've seen it all week in question period. We saw it over the weekend as the Conservatives held their special caucus meeting. They brought in not only all their MPs, but all their candidates, all their nominated candidates from across the country for special training session. And then Scheer addressed them all. And this has been the theme from Saturday through Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in the House. It's like all week. Vote for Justin Trudeau, your taxes are going to go up. He's been asking, will the carbon tax go to $300 a ton instead of just the $50 that Trudeau has promised? Because the Environment Department says it's got to be at least $300. The Finance Department, they point to a report from the Finance Department saying it's got to go up. They point to all the different ways that the Trudeau government has raised taxes. CPP premiums went up on January 1st. EI premiums, well, the rate went down, but the amount of coverage went up. And so employers are paying more. And they're trying to paint a picture that says life under Justin Trudeau, despite all the claims that he cut taxes for the middle class, it's actually more expensive, and you can't afford to elect the guy again. When you consider that Canadians are telling pollsters that they're worried about the financial situation, when you look at the poll that says 46% of Canadians say they feel about $200 shy a month from declaring insolvency, they're probably onto a good soundtrack, a good message track to push for the next election, because Canadians are not feeling all that confident about their economic prospects, and a lot of that has to do with what they're paying out to government.
Brian, we can find out next week if the Liberals are planning to go ahead with a possible handgun ban. Many MPs have spoken out against it, including Lethbridge MP, Rachel Harder, we've heard from Calgary MP, Michelle Rempel as well. And many legal gun owners say this will do nothing to take guns out of the hands of criminals.
Well, it simply won't happen. I mean, you don't have to be a gun-toting politician like Michelle Rempel. I know Michelle likes to go shooting. She shoots more than I do. You don't have to be a gun-toting politician to realize that. The problems that we're having in cities across the country is that criminals are shooting up the streets. They're trying to protect their fentanyl stash, their car fentanyl stash. And gun use has risen in lockstep with the opioid crisis that we've been dealing with. It's very lucrative. It also brings out a lot of violence. Turning around and saying to someone, well, you've got to give up your legally owned handgun, that doesn't take a gun out of the hands of the criminals. Police officials have come out and said this, but the government's still looking at it, or they're looking at things like centralized storage. So all of a sudden, you're going to have gun clubs that are often in remote areas have to build giant armories to store thousands of guns at once and then leave them out in the middle of nowhere unguarded. That's a recipe for disaster. But these are the solutions that the Liberals are looking at, that they're talking about. And Bill Blair, the minister that was put in charge of this, says he's bringing his recommendation shortly. They've been tight-lipped about it, but in terms of what the specifics will be. But they have talked about banning certain types of firearms from legal gun owners, and they've talked about centralized storage. Nothing that they've talked about in public has actually would do a thing to take a single gun out of the hands of the criminals that are shooting up our streets. And that should worry every Canadian, regardless of how you feel about sport shooters or hunters.
Award-winning journalist Brian Lilley joining me from Toronto. Thanks so much, Brian.
Thank you.